Brian held his breath as he stood at the top of his attic's wooden ladder, blinking into the dim space. Dust motes drifted lazily in the stale air. He'd been dreading this chore, sifting through the cluttered corners and abandoned boxes that had accumulated over the years. But money was tight this month, and he was convinced he had at least a few items up here that could fetch a decent price at the local swap meet. Hesitation tugged at him. From the outside, Brian lived a rather ordinary life in his early 30s, renting a modest apartment in a reasonably quiet neighborhood. Behind that veneer, however, he had a side that not many people knew about. It wasn't something he shared, and he certainly had no intention of making a grand proclamation of it. So as he pulled himself up into the attic, he checked his phone flashlight and took a cursory look around, determined to find exactly what he needed, and then return downstairs before any curious neighbors or friends could drop by uninvited. He recalled purchasing a small stereo system during college that was now sitting somewhere under layers of half-forgotten keepsakes. It was supposed to be one of his prime sellers at the swap meet. While rummaging through piles of college textbooks, old photo albums, and holiday decorations, he caught a glimpse of a green nylon duffel bag. Another flash of the phone's light revealed a near-identical black duffel bag next to it. He recognized them both from a sporting goods store sale years ago. Brian owned an assortment of such bags, usually purchased during deep discounts. They were perfect for storing winter clothes or old electronics. The green one definitely contained cables, random accessories, and maybe some VHS tapes. The black one could be for old sports gear. He faintly remembered some battered tennis rackets and deflated basketballs. Satisfied with his quick assumption, he opened one bag, found the stereo system's components, and started pulling them out. He didn't want to carry them loose, so he decided he would just cart them out in one of those duffel bags, maybe both if needed. He also spotted an older DVD player that he hadn't used in years, plus a tangle of speaker wires and a subwoofer. Even if he got only a small sum for them, every bit of cash counted. Before descending from the attic, his phone buzzed in his pocket, startling him enough that he nearly dropped a handful of dusty wires. Quickly, he fished out his phone to see a text from his friend Lucas. "You sure you can handle all that junk by yourself? I can drive up in about an hour." Brian typed back a quick, "No worries," not wanting to bother Lucas with his personal errands. He had done this kind of thing many times before. Pack up old items, drive to the swap meet, set up a table. It was just a matter of a few hours, maybe half a day. Then, hopefully, he could come home with extra cash in his pocket. He switched off the flashlight and shuffled toward the ladder, gently lowering the black duffel bag and then the green one onto the landing below. Though they were nearly identical in shape and size, he noted their straps were different colors. The green bag's strap was black, and the black bag's strap was dark gray. He shrugged, thinking it was a minor detail, not worth giving a second thought. But he did recall sometimes having used them for a different purpose, one that he tried not to dwell on too much when rummaging around in broad daylight. Nonetheless, he reminded himself that all that stuff was carefully tucked away in a safer spot. With a final glance, he set the duffel bags near the front door before heading to the kitchen for a glass of water. He woke early the next day, determined to get prime placement at the swap meet. The trunk of his car was already open, so he dragged the duffel bags outside, pausing only to double-check that his stereo and other electronics were inside at least one of the bags. He gave them a brief rummage. The presence of wires, metallic edges, and a heavy chunk that felt like a subwoofer was enough reassurance. He didn't realize that during his quick check, he was handling the green bag for some electronics and the black bag for the leftover cables and accessories. In the bustle of dawn, his main aim was to make sure everything fit. Next, he propped the table, folding chairs, and a cardboard sign reading "Brian's Deals" next to his old winter tires. Then he hopped in, turned on the ignition, and drove out, never suspecting that one of his prized secrets was in serious jeopardy. The local swap meet was a sprawling affair hosted in a large parking lot behind a strip mall. People rented spaces marked by faded lines on the asphalt. Brian liked to get there early because it allowed him to secure a spot near the main path of foot traffic. By the time he arrived, there were already vendors opening folding tables and draping them with items ranging from used clothing to antique trinkets. The sweet smell of kettle corn swirled in the breeze. Brian felt the usual flutter of excitement. There was always the chance of turning dusty boxes into cash. He parked, hauled out his table, and meticulously arranged the stereo equipment. He tested the DVD player with a small power inverter to prove to prospective buyers it still worked. And he placed the subwoofer at the center, labeling it with a price on a piece of fluorescent orange sticker. The morning sun was just rising behind him, casting long shadows across the pavement. A trickle of customers began meandering through the rows. Occasionally, a person would pause at Brian's table, ask a question, maybe chat for a minute, but there was no immediate sale. He wasn't worried. The real rush typically came a bit later, after folks had their morning coffee. Around midday, with more visitors milling about, a woman wearing a distinctive green sun hat appeared at the edge of Brian's table. She had a wide smile, and her eyes zeroed in on the stereo system. Brian's heart gave a little leap. She seemed genuinely interested. Perfect, he thought. This might be his first solid transaction of the day. As she inspected the stereo, running her hand across the dusty front panel and fiddling with the volume knob, Brian gave her a quick pitch about how it still sounded great and that the subwoofer would enhance the bass. She flashed a polite grin. "So, how much?" she asked, her voice a bit hesitant, like she was hoping for a bargain. Brian quoted a reasonable price, and she countered. He weighed her offer. It was lower than he wanted, but still fair, and he was more than ready to lighten his load. After a short back and forth, they agreed on a final figure. The woman handed over the cash, flashing that same warm smile as Brian counted the bills. He was pleased enough to accept. Next, he grabbed the green duffel bag from under his table, confident it held the stereo's various chords and manuals. He zipped it open just slightly to confirm there was something inside. He recognized a coil of cable in the gloom of the bag's interior. Although it was indeed the correct coil, sitting right on top, it was also resting atop something else. He didn't take time to dig deeper. Speed was the key. He had the line behind him, other potential shoppers waiting, and the woman looked eager to move on. She was rummaging in her large purse, presumably for her car keys. He snapped the bag shut, hoisted it onto the table, and said, "All yours." She nodded, patted the green bag absent-mindedly, and turned away. Only after she disappeared into the busy crowd did Brian glance back and realize the black duffel bag was still in the back seat of his car. Maybe that meant the stereo was still there. No, that wasn't possible. The buyer had walked off with the cables. Then it dawned on him that he should check the trunk. He strode over, popped it open, and saw, to his growing confusion, the stereo system carefully wrapped in plastic. The subwoofer was still there, along with the DVD player. A fierce jolt of panic coursed through him. If that was the stereo, then what on earth had he given the woman? He thought about the two identical duffel bags he'd brought from the attic. One was indeed full of electronics, but the other... The memory hit him like a sudden blow. The other bag contained his Brianna outfits, his shoes, dresses, wigs, plus other personal items he'd meticulously kept hidden for years. In a haze of distraction, he had apparently handed that bag to the woman with the green hat. For a long moment, he stood frozen by the trunk of his car, heart hammering so loudly he thought passers-by might hear it. The full weight of what had happened sank in. He'd just sold off not just an old stereo, but a window into his private habits, all zipped inside a gym bag. He couldn't let a total stranger examine that. He had to get it back. Immediately he abandoned his table, ignoring the people who paused to check out his remaining merchandise. His footsteps quickened as he dashed through rows of booths, scanning for any sign of that distinctive green hat. He felt dizzy, clumsy, as if each step might trip him up. Soon he was weaving between racks of vintage clothes, behind tables laden with old vinyl records, and around stacks of used novels. But she was nowhere to be found. He circled back and forth, trying in vain to spot that green sun hat among the crowd. But the mass of people had grown, and there were plenty of hats in different shades of green. Some were wearing teal caps, others lime baseball hats. He forced himself to breathe. Panicking would solve nothing. He needed a better plan. In a moment of desperate inspiration, he decided to ask around. Surely someone who had just purchased a stereo would have been noticed carrying a sizable duffel bag. He approached the nearest vendor, an older man selling homemade lamps. "Excuse me," Brian said, breathless. "Did you see a woman with a green hat pass by carrying a green bag?" The vendor, squinting against the sunlight, shrugged. "Green hat and green bag? Son, half the ladies in the summer around here wear hats. Sorry, I can't help you." Brian thanked him anyway and moved on. A few booths over, he repeated the question to a woman who was knitting on a foldable chair. She frowned, trying to recall. "I might have. She asked me about crocheted blankets, but I don't remember a bag." Brian muttered thanks and hustled farther along. At one point he saw a splash of green behind a table of used power tools. Adrenaline soared through him. He rushed forward, only to find a teenage girl wearing a neon green hoodie rummaging through a box of hardware. Not the woman in the sun hat. Brian forced himself to keep searching. 20 minutes of intense scouring left him soaked in sweat and short of breath. He stood near the kettle corn stand, where that toasty, sweet aroma made his stomach churn with stress. Maybe the woman had already gone home. Maybe she would open the bag later and wonder what on earth was inside. The thought of her reaction to the neatly folded dresses and shoes was too mortifying. Brian gritted his teeth. He needed a break to think. Gathering his composure, he walked back to his table, only to find Lucas standing there with raised eyebrows, arms folded. "You vanish for half an hour, and your stuff's just sitting here," Lucas said. "What's going on?" It took a moment for Brian to articulate the predicament without blurting out every detail. He considered lying, but Lucas was one of the few people he felt comfortable talking to, at least somewhat. Maybe he'd have a solution. Carefully, Brian pulled him aside. "Dude," he said, swallowing hard. "I messed up. There was a woman who wanted to buy the stereo. I accidentally handed her a different bag, a bag with my personal things." Lucas frowned. "So, personal how?" Brian tightened his jaw, scanning the crowd. "I'd rather not get into details, but let's say it's extremely personal. Now I can't find her, and I still have the stereo in my trunk." Lucas's eyes widened slightly, though he didn't pry further. "That's bad, real bad," he said. "We'll find her." Over the next hour, they split up and conducted a more thorough search, each weaving through aisles of blankets, tools, used clothes, DVDs, and homemade goods. They asked nearly every vendor they passed. A few had seen a green-hatted woman earlier, but had no idea where she went. Some shrugged as if they saw that style of hat multiple times a day. By early afternoon, the swap meet was teeming with customers, many of them just browsing. Brian's anxiety skyrocketed. He imagined the woman driving home, unzipping the bag, and her surprise, or perhaps confusion, as she pulled out the contents. Maybe she would be appalled, or maybe she wouldn't care at all. Neither scenario comforted him. He just wanted the bag back. "I can't stay here much longer," Lucas said eventually. "I have a shift at 4. Brian nodded. "Right. Thanks for helping," he replied, shoulders sagging. I guess I'll keep looking until this place closes. If I don't find her, I might try to trace the purchase. Maybe the security cameras in the parking lot?" Lucas gave him a doubtful look. "Not sure if they keep that footage. But good luck, man." With a quick pat on the shoulder, Lucas headed off. Brian returned to his booth, mentally exhausted. The day's initial excitement had dissolved into a gnawing worry. The few potential buyers who had approached his table while he was out searching had lost interest, and his table looked neglected, items scattered in a half-disorganized mess. He sat down, hands jittery. Then, near closing time, another vendor walked by and set a styrofoam cup of lemonade on Brian's table. "You look like you could use a drink," she said kindly. "Everything okay?" Brian mustered a tight smile. "I'm not sure yet," he said, "but thanks." He sipped the lemonade, the tartness momentarily cutting through his anxiety, and contemplated his next move. By the time he packed up his remaining items and folded his table, the crowd had begun to thin. Some folks drifted away, carrying their purchases, while vendors loaded unsold wares into trucks and vans. The warm glow of late afternoon light gave the asphalt a strange serenity, as though the day's busy commerce had never taken place. Brian looked around one last time, holding on to a sliver of hope that he might catch a glimpse of that woman in her bright green sun hat. But there was no sign of her. With a frustrated sigh, he climbed into his car and drove home. His only consolation was that he had the woman's payment, albeit that provided little comfort considering the potential embarrassment. He hardly slept that night, replaying the swap meet fiasco over and over in his mind. He imagined every possible scenario, the woman discovering the bag's contents and throwing them away, or possibly deciding to look for him to return the items. He toyed with the idea that she might open the bag, freeze in shock, then burst into laughter. Would she approach the swap meet organizers, or would she keep the bag? Brian tossed in bed, burying his face in the pillow. The thought of losing those outfits, pieces he'd chosen carefully over the years, felt strangely heartbreaking. But beyond that, the risk of exposure haunted him. He was a private person, and this was the last way he wanted the world to find out about his cross-dressing side. In the morning, he called Lucas to ask if there had been any updates or leads from the other vendors, but Lucas had nothing new to report. Brian grabbed his coffee and stared at the online classified listings. Maybe the woman would post about finding a lost bag. He scoured community boards, social media pages, even rummage sale groups, hoping for a mention of, "Hey, found a bag of clothes that aren't mine." But nothing surfaced. As the hours dragged on, he realized he might need a more direct approach. His phone rang around midday. He practically lunged to answer it, heart pounding. "Hello?" he said, breath tight. "Hi," a woman's voice responded. "Is this Brian from the swap meet?" He could have dropped the phone in that moment. She had found him. Relief soared. "Yes, that's me," he said, struggling to keep his tone even. "You bought the stereo, right?" A pause on her end, then a gentle laugh. "I think I ended up buying something else too." Brian felt his cheeks warming. "Yes, that was a huge mistake," he admitted. "I'm so sorry. I realized afterward that I handed you the wrong bag." He braced for a wave of questioning, or maybe an uncomfortable joke, but she remained calm. "I'm not upset," she said gently, "but I imagine you'd like it back." He breathed out, as though a giant weight had lifted off his shoulders. "Yes, if that's possible. I also still have the stereo, so I owe you that." They arranged to meet at a small coffee shop near the downtown area. Brian spent a good hour working up the courage to drive over, still on edge about how that conversation might go. When he arrived, he saw her seated at an outdoor table, the green sun hat now resting on her lap. Next to her chair was a duffel bag that looked identical to the ones he carried from the attic. He gulped, trying to maintain composure as he approached. "Hi," he said, voice slightly unsteady. "I'm really grateful you called." She stood and extended her hand. "I'm Elise," she said, offering a kind smile. "I'm glad I found you too. I'd hate to keep something that obviously meant a lot to someone else." Brian nodded, relieved that she seemed friendly. Taking the seat opposite her, he placed the stereo system box carefully on the table. "I'm sorry about all this confusion," he began. "I was in a rush at the swap meet, and I must have grabbed the wrong bag." Elise nodded, accepting his explanation. She rubbed her thumb over the duffel's handle, glancing at it briefly. "Well, I'll just say it wasn't what I expected," she ventured, her tone matter-of-fact. Brian's stomach clenched. He was uncertain how much detail she wanted or expected. It's private," he managed. She offered a warm nod, not pressing further. "It's not my business," she assured. "The only reason I opened it at all was to see if the stereo was inside, and, well, I saw what was in there. I figured I should get it back to you." Her lack of judgment or condescension took Brian by surprise. He relaxed by a fraction, enough to lift the stereo system and hand it to her. "Here's what you actually paid for," he said, exhaling an anxious laugh. "Hopefully it still works well for you." Elise thanked him and accepted the stereo, then slid the duffel bag forward. "I guess I don't need to say I didn't tamper with anything. Everything's there as I found it," she said gently. Brian nodded, cheeks burning as he slipped the bag handle over his shoulder. He was reluctant to open it in public, though a part of him wanted to confirm everything was indeed in there. Instead, he smiled shyly. "Thank you, Elise. You have no idea what this means to me. Really." She laughed a bit, the tension lifting. "I'll survive without an explanation, but if you ever need to unload a secret or two, well, I've seen worse. Trust me." She glanced at her phone, pressing the screen. "I need to get going soon, but I'm glad you got your bag back. And my new stereo, of course." Brian gave an awkward chuckle. "Yeah, you can test it out at home now." They shook hands again. Brian's face still felt overheated, but her easy demeanor lessened the blow of potential humiliation. She raised a polite wave, walked away carrying the stereo, and left Brian feeling a strange mixture of embarrassment, gratitude, and leftover anxiety that buzzed in his veins. He placed the duffel bag in his car's passenger seat, determined to verify its contents the moment he got home. The drive back felt like a dream. He was still coming off the adrenaline of the near catastrophe. In the safety of his apartment, with the door bolted behind him, he dumped the bag's contents onto the couch. The carefully folded dresses, the heels, the wig, all there. Nothing appeared missing or damaged. Brian sank onto a chair, covering his face with both hands. He'd dodged an enormous bullet. If Elise had been a different kind of person, he might have faced endless ridicule or even blackmail. He wasn't naive enough to think such things never happened, but she had handled it without judgment. For that, he couldn't help but feel a surge of gratitude. Now, though, the memory of that near loss left him with a new sense of caution. He felt shaky, thinking of how easily everything had spiraled out of control. It was a stark reminder of how a single lapse in attention could blow open the private corners of his life. After draping the dresses back on their hangers and returning the shoes to his closet, he sat at his kitchen table, hands curled around a mug of lukewarm tea. The day had been exhausting, physically and emotionally, but at least it ended on a note of relief. He still had the items that made him feel whole in his private time, and nobody had broadcast the incident to the world. In the following days, Brian found his mood swinging between lingering embarrassment and a subdued elation that Elise had handled the situation gracefully. He thought of calling her or sending a message to thank her again, but he didn't want to appear clingy or awkward. She had signaled her acceptance of the situation, or at least her willingness to keep it quiet, and that was more than he could have hoped for. Whenever he caught sight of the duffel bag in his apartment, though, the memory of those frantic hours at the swap meet returned, complete with his panicked sprint through the vendor aisles in search of a green hat. He decided it would be wise to relocate his private belongings to a container clearly labeled or perhaps locked away, so no confusion could ever happen again. Lucas stopped by one evening to check on Brian's state of mind. He offered an apologetic grin as he walked into the living room. "Heard the bag got returned," he said. "I was worried you might never see it again." Brian shrugged. "It was a near disaster, but I got lucky. The buyer was an honest person." Lucas nodded, then gave him a curious glance. "So, are you going to keep going to swap meets after all that?" Brian considered the question for a moment. "Probably. I made some money, and honestly, I do like the vibe of it. But next time, I'll be triple-checking my bags." Lucas sank into Brian's second-hand recliner, rummaging in his jacket pocket for a pack of gum. "Yeah, good call," he said, chewing thoughtfully. "You were all over that parking lot, man. I've never seen you so panicked." Brian slumped into the couch, letting out a groan. "I don't think I've ever felt so vulnerable in my life." He caught himself, remembering that mention of vulnerability might invite deeper questions from Lucas. But Lucas, fortunately, only nodded sympathetically. A few days later, Brian was running errands when his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen to see a text from an unknown number. It read, "Hope the duffel bag is safe and sound. Stereo is perfect. Thanks again. Elise." He reread the short note, a small smile tugging at his lips. How she'd gotten his number, he wasn't sure. Maybe from an old rummage sale slip or from the conversation at the coffee shop. But either way, her text was a kind gesture. He typed back a brief response. "All good here. Glad the stereo is working for you. Thanks again for your honesty." He left it at that, uncertain if there was more to say or if they would go their separate ways. Moments later, another text arrived. "No problem. Maybe we'll run into each other again. Take care." Brian felt a strange warmth at her friendly tone. The crisis was over, but part of him didn't mind the idea of crossing paths with her again under less stressful circumstances. In the aftermath, he found himself reflecting on how it all could have gone worse. He imagined a scenario where the bag was given to a person who thought it was some kind of sick joke or exploited it on social media. That possibility gave him nightmares. But fate had led him to a genuine, kind individual. Though he still felt jitters recalling the humiliating close call, he also recognized that in some small corner of his heart, he was relieved to have found compassion in a stranger. A week later, Brian was back at the local community center to pick up some flyers. The building housed a library on one side and a multi-purpose hall on the other, where the next rummage sale was scheduled to take place. As he navigated the corridors, he thought about possibly renting a booth again. He still had that stereo equipment in his trunk. Well, he had parted with a second set of speakers, but the one he actually sold to Elise had obviously been replaced by his own bag fiasco. He might as well try to sell the correct items now. Perhaps he'd be more diligent about labeling his bags, and maybe use a big plastic tote instead of a duffel. That would avoid confusion entirely. His phone buzzed, another text from Elise. "Hey, do you know anything about hooking up older speakers with the new stereo? I'm having trouble." Brian blinked, a slight grin forming. Another chance to salvage some dignity. He typed back, "Sure. It can be tricky sometimes. If you're free, I could stop by and help set it up." She replied within seconds. "That would be great. How about tomorrow evening? And so the next day found Brian knocking on the door of her small townhouse on a tree-lined street, feeling a mixture of anticipation and mild embarrassment. Elise greeted him wearing casual jeans and a blue sweater, sans the green hat. She welcomed him inside, leading him to her living room, where the stereo was neatly placed on a shelf near a television. Cables snaked across the floor, looking a bit chaotic. After a bit of fiddling, Brian had the system up and running, the old speakers cooperating with the new device. He showed Elise how to adjust a few settings, explaining the difference between using digital inputs and the older analog cables. The conversation turned pleasantly easygoing. Elise offered him a glass of iced tea, and they sat down on her couch, talking about the oddities of rummage sales and the characters one often meets there. At one point, though, she briefly broached the topic of the mix-up. "I was really startled when I looked in that bag," she confessed, not with a mocking tone, but a friendly candor. Brian felt a flush creep up his neck. "I can only imagine," he said, shaking his head. "I can't apologize enough for that." She laid a hand lightly on his forearm, a reassuring gesture. "It's fine, truly. Everyone has their own private side. Sometimes it just surfaces in unexpected ways." Though the conversation was light, Brian was aware of the unspoken topic hovering just below the surface. She had seen his outfits, knew that these items didn't match the typical contents of a gym bag. There was a fleeting moment where he feared she'd ask direct questions that might corner him, but she only mentioned it with the same kindness she'd shown before. For that, he was grateful. By the time he left her house, the stereo fully functional, they shared a warm goodbye. It felt good to close that chapter on a positive note, rather than letting it remain an unresolved embarrassment. Over the following weeks, Brian returned to his routine, working his day job, occasionally socializing with Lucas, and once in a while indulging in his private pastime in the comfort of his apartment. He'd found a sturdier, locked trunk for his more cherished items, ensuring that no accidental mix-ups could happen again. Meanwhile, he and Elise exchanged sporadic text messages, mostly about mundane stuff. She'd joke about rummage sales or share a funny anecdote she encountered. Their conversation never again directly referenced the bag fiasco, almost as if they'd silently agreed to leave it behind. Yet something had shifted in Brian's outlook. The ordeal had proven that strangers could react with more empathy than he had ever dared to hope. Lucas, of course, was curious about the outcome. "You guys keep in touch?" he probed one afternoon, when they were grabbing burgers at a local diner. Brian shrugged non-committally. "Kind of. She'll send me a random text now and then. I guess we're on good terms." Lucas smirked. "Better than no terms." Brian rolled his eyes but smiled. "At least I didn't lose the bag. That was my biggest fear." Lucas responded with a playful snort. "Honestly, I've seen you in a panic before, but that day at the swap meet was top-tier panic mode. You looked like you were ready to break down." Brian gave a soft laugh, swirling the ice in his soda cup. "It was horrifying in the moment, but hey, I survived." The community rummage sale eventually came around. Brian decided to participate again, more cautiously this time. He arrived with a carefully labeled plastic bin for electronics and a cardboard box for clothes he wanted to sell, which of course did not include anything from his private stash. This time, the sale was indoors at the multipurpose hall, so vendors set up on long tables under fluorescent lights. The environment was a little more formal than the usual open-air swap meet, but it had its own charm. Brian laid out some old video game controllers, computer accessories, and finally, the stereo system he'd neglected to sell earlier. He was determined to do it properly this time. Periodically, he found himself glancing at the entrance, half expecting Elise might wander in. She hadn't mentioned attending, but he felt a tiny stirring of hope anyway. About an hour into the sale, He was chatting with a retired couple about the brand name of the stereo when he caught a glimpse of that unmistakable green hat from the corner of his eye. Elise was weaving through the vendors, apparently scanning the tables for bargains. She eventually locked eyes with him, a flicker of amusement crossing her face. "Well, fancy seeing you here," she said, stepping closer. Brian returned her smile. "I can't stay away from these events," he replied with a shrug. "Something about turning junk into treasure, I guess." Elise chuckled, leaning over to peer at the stereo. "You still have this?" she teased. "I remember what happened last time." Brian grimaced dramatically. "Yes, but I'm being super careful with all my bags now. I've improved my packing game since then." She laughed. "Glad to hear it." They spent a few minutes catching up, mostly small talk about the rummage sale, the crowd, and the interesting pieces on display at the other tables. Some elaborate homemade candles drew her attention. She strolled over to check them out, but returned soon after, having decided not to buy. A comfortable banter came easily between them, though every now and then Brian was struck by the memory of their initial meeting, how drastically it had pivoted from a typical buyer-seller transaction to a bizarre comedic scramble. While Elise was there, a man approached Brian's table, seriously contemplating the stereo. Elise slid out of the conversation, letting Brian negotiate. After a few minutes, a sale was made. The man paid in cash, and Brian methodically packed the stereo into the carefully labeled plastic bin, double-checking that all cables were inside. No duffel bag fiasco this time. He handed everything over with a polite smile, feeling a surge of relief. Finally, the stereo was sold, cleanly and properly, to the right person. Elise raised an eyebrow in approval. "Nicely done," she said jokingly. "No mix-ups." Brian breathed a mock sigh of relief. "Thank goodness, right?" They shared a laugh. Then Elise picked up a small, half-broken clock from Brian's table, inspecting it. "Does this work?" she asked, pressing the button on its side. Brian hesitated. "It used to, but now it randomly stops. I was going to let it go for $1. She smiled. "I'll take it. Might be a fun project to fix." She handed him $1 coin, and he handed the clock over with a grateful nod. The small exchange carried a sense of playful symbolism. Where once they had a bungled transaction overshadowed by confusion and secrecy, now it was just a straightforward moment of camaraderie. They chatted a bit more, parted ways, and continued to browse. Brian found himself feeling lighter, buoyed by how a potential nightmare had transformed into an odd but meaningful connection. By the end of the rummage sale, he'd sold several items, made a decent sum, and parted with the stereo that had catalyzed the entire fiasco. He left the community center in an upbeat mood, thinking how life had a strange way of steering him into unexpected encounters. Over the subsequent months, Brian stayed busy with work. He and Elise chatted intermittently, meeting up a few times for coffee or a quick lunch. Their conversations ranged from daily life to random, silly topics. Never once did she ridicule him or pry about the details of what she had glimpsed in his duffel bag. That unspoken understanding between them allowed Brian a sense of calm he wasn't sure he'd ever experienced before. He realized that while she knew, she treated him no differently, and that was quietly comforting. However, he kept his personal habits discreet, just as always. The difference was that he no longer felt quite as crushed by the possibility of being discovered. That single event at the swap meet had forced him to confront the worst-case scenario in a way, and somehow he'd come out all right. One afternoon, while rummaging in the same attic for unrelated items, he found himself staring at the place where those two duffel bags used to sit side by side. Now, only a single bag lay there. The other had found its new home in a locked trunk in his bedroom. He exhaled, recalling the chaos of that day, the swirl of the swap meet crowd, the panic creeping through him, his hurried questions to uninterested vendors, Strange how quickly life can tilt into a comedic crisis, only to correct itself if given enough time and the right circumstances. He tried to imagine how all that might look on a movie screen, perhaps a frenzied comedic sequence. But in real life, it had felt more like his heart might explode. He eventually closed the attic hatch and descended the ladder, carrying whatever items he needed for a new rummage sale project. The memory no longer paralyzed him with dread. Instead, it was just that, a memory, potent, but part of a larger tapestry of experiences. From then on, every time he secured the trunk that held his personal attire, he thought about how close he'd come to losing it all, how he'd grown more protective of it, and how it all turned out better than he ever could have expected. He learned to label everything meticulously and avoided using identical bags if he could help it. Future yard sales found him with plastic totes, color-coded stickers, and an almost paranoid attention to detail. Yet life carried on, ordinary in many ways. Brian still frequented local swap meets, though always glancing around for a friendly face in a green sun hat. Sometimes Elise came along, either to buy a few knickknacks or just to chat. And while Brian never directly brought up the contents of the bag, he occasionally caught her sideways grin that suggested the shared secret was still in the back of her mind. It wasn't an awkward grin, but more an affectionate acknowledgement of something they'd both been through, a bizarre, comedic intersection of two strangers' lives. Gradually, the comedic near-disaster at the swap meet settled into a story that Brian recounted, albeit omitting the more personal details, whenever someone asked him about weird yard sale mishaps. "I once sold the wrong bag," he'd say, and chuckle, leaving out the specifics. If pressed, he'd wave it off with a vague, "It was complicated, but it worked out." That was the extent of his confessions. Only Lucas and Elise held the fuller version of that story, which neither of them ever paraded around. In that sense, it became a subtle thread of trust woven between them. By the time winter arrived, Brian had sold off most of his surplus electronics and old trinkets. He felt good about the decluttering, proud that he had avoided any further fiascos. On a quiet, snowy evening, he found himself once more inspecting the locked trunk in his bedroom. The knowledge of what lay inside still gave him a sense of private comfort. Instead of shame, though, he felt a guarded sort of peace. The memory of Elise's kindness encouraged him not to fear that side of himself too deeply. Though he kept it under wraps, he no longer worried incessantly that a single slip-up would ruin him. After all, he'd made the biggest slip-up imaginable, and come out the other side with a new friend. That winter, he also planned a small holiday gathering at his place, inviting Lucas, a couple of co-workers, and after some hesitation, Elise. She arrived with a plate of homemade cookies and teased Brian about the meager decorations he'd strung up around the apartment. "You call this festive?" she asked, tapping a drooping garland. He just laughed, thankful for her presence and the warmth it brought. The group mingled, the conversation eventually turning to rummage sales, as they so often do in that circle. Elise shot Brian a quick knowing smile when the topic surfaced, and he changed the subject to the best finds they'd seen, rather than the worst mishaps. Later in the evening, while Lucas showed a co-worker a goofy photo on his phone, Elise tapped Brian on the arm. "Hey," she said quietly, "I never asked if you want your old green duffel bag back." He blinked, recalling that indeed she still might have the bag he originally handed her. "It's just in my garage," she explained. "You left that coffee shop carrying your black one, didn't you? I realized later I never gave you the green one. You replaced it with the stereo box or something. I've been meaning to check." Brian's eyes widened. "You're right," he murmured, trying to recall the detail. Everything had been a flurry of confusion that day. "I'd appreciate getting that bag back, unless you need it." She shook her head, chuckling. I have plenty of bags. I'll bring it next time I'm in the area. They exchanged a small smile, a silent reference to the comedic web that had brought them together. When the holiday party ended and the guests trickled out into the chilly night, Brian lingered by his door, watching Elise walk to her car. She turned once, offering a casual wave. It was a simple gesture that reminded him how a random chance encounter, fueled by confusion and a bit of panic, could transform into something unexpectedly meaningful. He closed his door and took a seat on the couch, letting that thought settle. He felt a twinge of gratitude that, despite the chaos that started this whole ordeal, he had emerged with his privacy mostly intact and gained an understanding friend. In the new year, Elise did indeed drop by his apartment, green duffel bag in hand. Inside it were some packing materials, random leftover wires, and a user manual for the stereo that had gotten jumbled during their initial swap fiasco. They both burst out laughing as they examined the contents, recalling how none of these items had caused the meltdown, merely the mistaken identity of the black and green bags. It's like returning a library book months overdue, Elise quipped, handing it over. Brian lifted the bag, marveling at how an ordinary object could hold so much comedic tension. No late fees, right? He joked back. She gave him a playful eye roll, then stepped inside for a cup of coffee. They chatted for a while, the conversation wandering from rummage sales to the best local diners. At no point did they mention the clothes in Brian's other bag, nor did they need to. The entire fiasco had found resolution, and neither felt a need to revisit that tension. After she left, Brian placed the green bag in a closet, hugging it to his chest for a brief moment as he set it down, fully aware of the wave of relief that he could do so with zero fear. Time continued on. Eventually, the story of that day at the swap meet took its rightful place in Brian's memory, no longer a top-of-mind horror, but a curious anecdote that sometimes made him smirk when it drifted into his thoughts. He came to see it as a close call that showed him a more generous side of human nature. Another rummage sale or swap meet would come, but he'd never again make the mistake of blindly handing a bag to someone without checking. If anything, he felt he'd grown more aware, more careful, and more capable of weathering life's unexpected twists. He also recognized in small but perceptible ways that some people might meet him with empathy if given a chance. Now and then, he'd still catch a glimpse of that green sun hat in a crowd, maybe someone else's hat, a random woman walking down the street, and it would spark the memory. His heart might flutter for a split second at the recollection, but it would subside into a calm acceptance that one misstep didn't have to define him. Ultimately, that bag mix-up had triggered a comedic chase that neither he nor Elise would likely forget, but it had also formed a positive link between them. On a random spring afternoon, as Brian sorted through the last of his rummage-worthy items, he paused to look at the black duffel bag once again, the one he had stashed behind the locked trunk. He didn't think of the event as a tragedy or a fiasco anymore. He thought of it as a cautionary tale with a surprisingly good outcome. And with that, he zipped it shut for safekeeping, planning to place it inside a sturdy plastic tote in case he ever ventured back to his attic. The memory would always be there, yes, but it was no longer a fresh terror. It had become a humorous footnote in his life story, one that tested his boundaries, made him sweat buckets, and taught him that sometimes the unexpected can bring about connections you never saw coming. All that remained was for him to move forward, continuing to balance the various pieces of his life. He still had items to sell, still had random weekend outings to fill. He looked back at the comedic swirl of near misses, the abrupt game of hide-and-seek in the swap meet crowd, and the final relief when Elise returned his things. He felt more centered, though he wouldn't dare label the experience as purely positive. It had been stressful beyond measure. Still, it underscored that mistakes happen, secrets slip out, and if you're lucky, you'll collide with a kind soul who respects your dignity. In the end, that single day in a crowded parking lot with the wrong duffel bag taught him not to assume the worst. Outside his window, the spring sunlight was bright, promising fresh days ahead. Brian looked at his phone and smiled, remembering Elise's last text about checking out a farmer's market together sometime. Maybe next weekend, he mused. Another day, another sale. This time, hopefully, with no confusion about which bag was which. He gently patted the black duffel bag, opened his closet, and slid it onto a shelf away from the rummage boxes. Then he headed to the kitchen to make dinner, his steps lighter, his spirits raised. Life could still be comedic chaos at times, but at least now he knew he could handle it and maybe even find a friend along the way.
Did you like the story? Hit that like button and tell me what you thought in the comments. Do you want to hear more stories? Subscribe and hit the bell. For exclusive content and early access, check out our Patreon. You can find the link in the description, or you can watch any of the videos shown on my right. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.